That's what made me think.
Fred. Van Austin.
Oh, what happened, Fred?
You guys see the? You guys see something? See the slide presentation on the screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yep, we're good.
I don't know why I should take this. You guys. A little, there should be a window. Can you see? Do you see a window of people on the side?
Yes.
Okay, I don't see that. That's okay. Okay. So today we're going, as I mentioned, we're starting picking up our Methodism 101 class. This is session 1, and we're going to be talking about the early life of John Wesley in Epworth, England, his childhood. And so we'll start off with a video. Before we do that, we're going to have an opening prayer, and then we're going to consider meanings for the word revival. This is really started in the All right, let us pray. Holy God, we come seeking to feel spiritually refreshed and revived as we explore how to renew our spiritual vitality and that of the church. Make us aware of your presence among us in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Okay, so we're going to start off by talking about revival. What do you guys think of when you think of the word revival?
John, you're awfully hard to hear and understand.
Yeah, I turned my microphone away from me. I'm sorry. Okay. That's
Much
probably
better.
okay.
It's better.
Yes. What do you guys? The word revival. What comes to mind when you guys think of revival? Big tent is what Carol says.
Yep.
Big
And
tent.
meetings.
A new. Okay, that's good. Alive. Right. That's all. That's good. Any other words that you can think of? Uplifting. Yes. Uplifting. These are all. Yeah. Things that these were all things that brought that I think the Methodist movement brought to Christianity at that time. So all those things. So I think all of those are great definitions of revival. Any other thoughts?
Lots of singing.
Lots of singing. Yes, that's a big Methodist tradition. Singing.
Yes.
Talk about
And eating.
eating. Yes, yes, and that is important. Breaking bread together. That's a very important thing. It's not just eating, but it's eating with friends and sharing what we have. I think that's a wonderful, and this is what the early Christians did, right? When they were in the story of Acts, they had gathered together to break bread together, to eat together every night. That was the church, and that's why it was so strong back then. And that was something that John Wesley was trying to recreate in his vision of Christianity, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So let me give you a definition that I got of revival, which really incorporates all that you guys just said. I'm going to bring that up and share this again. So revival is based on the Latin word revivere, which means to reinvigorate, to restore to life, to become strong and healthy after a period of decline. So with these ideas that we brought up forth of new life, it also implies that there was decline before that. So, and we're reviving somebody back to life. And okay, so we're gonna, just before we get the video started, we'll talk about some of the things that people have said about the movement that John Wesley and Charles Wesley and all the early Methodists started. Said it was the greatest Christian revolutions. Philip Yancey says, the greatest Christian revolutions come not by the discovery of something that was not known before. They happen when somebody takes radically something that was always there. And then well, we'll get into this in a minute, but we'll leave with that quote on Philippians, and then we'll have a little video, and then we'll get on with our conversation. Oh, there it is.
And so we come to England, to the place that is arguably the birthplace of Methodism, the Epworth Rectory, the parsonage that belonged to the St. Andrew's Parish Church, where Samuel Wesley was assigned in 1697, where with his wife Susanna they would have children and where they would teach them the faith. Among the children that they raised was John Wesley, born in 1703, who would go on to be the founder of the Methodist movement, along with his younger brother Charles. Now, they weren't actually born in this house. This house was built in 1709. They were born in the house that was on this plot of land before. And it was here, as they were nurtured by their mother, Susanna, that they learned the faith. From the time they could begin to speak, she taught them the Lord's Prayer. She was the one who educated all of her children, each of them shaped and formed by not only their father's deep faith, but by their mother's deep faith and disciplined life. Now, Methodists are people of disciplined faith. Methodists are people with a methodical approach to the faith, and John Wesley learned that from his mother. His mother taught him the alphabet, actually insisted they learn it in one day. She taught the children, when they could learn to speak, to pray the Lord's Prayer. She spent an hour a day, it said, in prayer herself, and she wanted her children not only to be cognitively or intellectually formed, but also spiritually formed. She was a woman who was highly educated, unusual in the 18th century. She not only had an education, but she insisted that not only her sons, but her daughters also be well educated. And it was in the kitchen of the Epworth Rectory that they were taught their lessons. Now, in 1709, the rectory was burned to the ground, probably by unsettled parishioners of Samuel Wesley, those who were frustrated by him, because in this area, this was a swampy territory that had been drained of the swamps and part of the land been taken away by the king, and the people in these parts didn't care much for the king. But here came Samuel Wesley and his sophisticated and educated wife, Susanna, who were city folks and who also themselves were loyal to the king. And so it's thought that perhaps some of those who were frustrated with his preaching and teaching had actually set his house on fire. This house was rebuilt shortly after that, when John was 6 years old, and it was here that he continued to grow up until at the age of 11 he was sent to London to study at the Charterhouse School. I'd like to take you through this house so you can see a bit of what's here, and I'd want you to know that the folks at the Epworth Rectory are hoping that Americans might come and visit and might be supportive of their efforts to maintain and to restore this great treasure of our Methodist way, our Methodist faith. So let's take a wander through the house, and then we'll head over to the St. Andrew's Church. Now I'd like to take you inside the Church of St. Andrew. It's a 12th century church. It was served by Samuel Wesley as rector for 39 years. So I'm standing in the St. Andrew's Parish Church, and it was this church that Samuel Wesley served for 35 years, where the family lived at the Epworth Rectory. It was in this actual baptismal font that John Wesley was baptized by his father. Charles also baptized here. And it was using this chalice that Samuel Wesley served the Eucharist to the people in this congregation. John would have received the Eucharist from this cup many times, and when he was old enough, when he came back to serve as the curate here, as the associate pastor with his father, that he would have served the Eucharist to the people as well. It's a beautiful congregation, a beautiful building, and a congregation that still is vibrant and alive all of these years later, but a place in which we remember the spiritual formation of John Wesley and his brother Charles. While we're here at the St. Andrew's Church, I wanted you to see the place where Samuel is buried. He died in 1735. He was 72 years old, and this is where he was laid to rest. And I wanted you to see this in part because one of the most famous scenes in Methodism occurs right here. After John was no longer allowed to preach in many of the churches, he came here to his own home church where he'd served as curate, where his father had been pastor for 35 years, and he was not invited to preach in the church. And so the pastor who was serving this church wasn't a very effective preacher. There weren't many who were coming to worship, but it was announced that John would preach outside the church that afternoon. And so a large crowd of people gathered around, and he came here to preach, and he stood on top of his father's grave in order to preach the message that day. And while there were only a handful who showed up for church at St. Andrew's that day, when John began to preach, there were hundreds who gathered around to hear him proclaim the gospel on top of his father's grave. So from here, let's go back to the Epworth Rectory where the family lived. I'm standing in the gardens behind the Epworth Rectory. These gardens have been planted lately, but they are beautiful reminders of John Wesley's book, The Primitive Physic, which was a book on health. He was very interested in health and helping people be healthier. And every plant in here is mentioned in the Primitive Physic as having some curative ability, some ability to make one whole. And there are little signs next to each plant that describe how Wesley said, if you were sick with this, you should take this particular kind of plant. I mentioned briefly the story of the burning of the Epworth Rectory. This was in 1709. We think it was the townsfolk who were angry with Samuel Wesley for his support of the king, his politics. And it was a reflection of the fact that there were folks here in this area and in his parish that didn't care much for him, but a pretty drastic statement. Many pastors have had parishioners who weren't very fond of them and perhaps wrote a letter of complaint to the district superintendent or bishop. These folks burned the rectory down. But something nearly tragic happened that night. Samuel and Susanna gathered up the children once smoke was smelled and it was clear that the house was on fire, burning rapidly. And they managed to escape with all of the children save one. And that was little John. 6 years old, he was in his bed, didn't hear the sound of the others crying out. The flames began to engulf the house. There was no way. They tried to rush back in and rush up to the upstairs to retrieve John, and there was no way they could retrieve him. Samuel gathers those around him in prayer and begins to pray for his son John, that God would entrust him or would save him and deliver him, or at the very least, or maybe the very most, take him up into God's eternal presence. But the townsfolk did more than pray. They actually acted, and there were two of them. One climbed on the shoulders of another, and they reached up and they saw John in the window just before the house was to burn down, and he jumped into their arms and he was saved. It was his mother, Susanna, that night when the entire family gathered around to praise God and thank God for sparing little John. It was Susanna who quoted the prophet Zechariah, saying he was like a brand plucked from the burning. And that quote, that line from Scripture would continue to resonate with John throughout his life. He would refer to himself as a brand plucked from the burning. And the idea that he held with that, the thought was that God had delivered him and had delivered him for a purpose, that God's providence was at work in not the fire, but in God's deliverance of him from that fire. And so he had a sense of destiny, a sense that I have been saved by God for something. And throughout his life, as he was searching for that something, he clearly found it in his founding of the Methodist movement. Through this one boy, saved from the window of the Epworth Rectory, came a movement that would literally transform the world. I wonder if you've ever had an experience like that, something so profound where it felt like God had delivered you or led you in a different direction, or something had happened that fundamentally changed your life. And in John's case, he took the time to ask the question, as he was growing up, what might be God's purpose for my life? What is his calling for me to fulfill? He spared me and saved me. It must be for a reason. And John would come to discover that the reason for God sparing him was to reach non-religious and nominally religious people and help them come to find Christ. The calling that he would fulfill would be to send those people out into the world to live out their faith in the world, to transform the communities around them as they embodied the love of Christ. And he felt this tremendous call to be a part of renewing the church. We're going to learn more about that call of Wesley's life and how he fulfilled it in the weeks to come. But I wonder, have you taken the time to ask, God, what is your purpose for my life? What is the calling you have for me to fulfill?
Interesting.
Great. Okay, so share the slide presentation.
Maybe the only ones left after that Charles Wesley.
Well, Joyce was there.
Oh, yes.
Can you guys see the slide presentation?
Yes.
If I change the screen, does the slide change?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know if that helps us really. Yeah, I guess it does. Okay. All right. So the Church of England, John Wesley was an Anglican priest. His father was an Anglican priest in England at the time. And if you know the history, you guys, if you're familiar with the history of the Church of England, which is the Anglican Church, that's another name for the Anglican Church. The Church of England was formed in the 1500s with Henry VIII. That you might remember the story that he wanted to divorce his wife, and the church wouldn't let him divorce his wife. So Martin Luther had already posted his thesis, and there are already Protestants on the mainland Europe, and Henry VIII said, well, I'm going to leave the Catholic Church too, because he wanted to divorce his wife. So he formed the Church of England. And at first, the Church of England looked very much like the Catholic Church. And it's still, the Anglican Church has many of the services look very much oftentimes like a Catholic service. And that's why sometimes the Methodist Church sometimes has the same sort of structure the Catholic service has as well. So after Henry VIII, there was a brief return back to Catholicism. One of his daughters was Catholic, and some Catholics came back, and she was eventually overthrown, and then there was a return back to the Church of England. And then when that happened, there was a movement to sort of purge a lot of the Catholic. They went and destroyed monasteries, all sorts of things. In England, in Ireland especially, a lot of the monasteries that existed before under the Catholic Church, and then even for a while under the Church of England, were destroyed because there was such a reaction to Catholicism. And then you're probably familiar with the Puritans, because our pilgrims come from the Puritan sect. And that was really a part of the Anglican Church. It wasn't a separate denomination, but it's a very devout group of Anglican pastors. So they, for a while, there was another revolution in the country where they tried to put in a king that seemed to be more favorable towards Catholicism. And so there was a rebellion between Parliament and the king, and there were wars. William Cromwell, for a while, was not the king, but he was kind of like the leader of England for a while, until he eventually died and they returned back to a king. Well, actually, he was alive when they returned back to a king, but He eventually ceded power to a king again. But by that time, England became solidly Protestant, and they left a lot of the traditions of Catholicism, even though there have been popular movements what they call there's a difference in the Anglican Church between high church Anglicanism and low church Anglicanism, or like high church Episcopals who are from the Anglican family, and low church Episcopals. The high church Episcopals have a service much more like with the liturgy, much more like the Catholics, much more organized, not organized, I should say, but formal and with lots of music and things like that. Anyway, that's the trajectory of the Church of England. By the late 17th century, so we're talking about the late 1600s, there was a sort of a fatigue with all of this religious bickering. And so a lot of people kind of like, I would say it's very similar to today. There was a perceived, but there was also, among Christians, there was a perceived moral laxity in much of the country, especially the Puritans were around back then, and they were really pushing to return back to piety. So there were movements at that time to try to revive the Anglican Church, to try to bring back piety in the Anglican Church, because there was so much fatigue with religiosity at the time. Piety means being very devout, getting up, like reading, your practice is get up to pray early in the morning. Yeah, following certain practices to live more devoutly. Okay, and then deism is was a popular, what's the word? It's not really a theology, but it was a way of thinking back then. And deism believes in God, but they kind of believe more in God as like someone who created everything and then sort of let it be. And then now we humans are on our own, basically. It's kind of like there's an illustration of God as a clockmaker, that he sets up the clock, winds it, and then off it goes, right? So there's less interest in this revelation of feeling, having this personal relationship with God. There's less of an emphasis on organized religion. A lot of our founding fathers were deists. Some of them, not all of them, but Thomas Jefferson was definitely a deist. He was not a churchgoer. In fact, he did revere the Bible, but there's some parts of the Bible he didn't like so much. So he had edited out the parts he didn't like and created his own version of the Bible. So that was kind of the mentality, also the mentality of the late 16 and the 1700s. So kind of as a response to that, we have these Anglican renewal groups. These were the groups that were trying to be more pious. And this is a response to the deism and the questionable morals. Its goal was to have a real holiness of heart and life, to bring back personal holiness through prayer and singing and all these ways that we love about when we go to church and we get together, and all these things are worship together. And so they set up these different societies. The Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge, SPCK, the Society for Reformation of Manners, SRM, and the Society to Propagate the Gospel. So these were popular societies at the time. And John Wesley was a member of the SPCK and also the SPG, because the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel had sent out missionaries to America at the time. This is before their revolution, so these were colonies. So the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel was the society that sent John Wesley out to Georgia when he went to Georgia. Mm-hmm. Can you guys see that the screen should say Annual Renewal Group Societies? Is that what you see?
Yep.
Okay, good. Just wanna. Sometimes this The slide presentation stuff doesn't work so well through Zoom. Okay, so we consider John Wesley the father of Methodism. And his brother was also played a very integral role, Charles Wesley, in launching the church. And their lives had earned them a place of permanent distinction in the Christian community, not just among Methodists, but among all Christians today, because we would not have had an evangelical movement without this Wesleyan Methodist movement, because a lot of the evangelical movement sprung out of this Reformation, this revival that John Wesley had started. Some of the people that were in the Methodists did not agree with Wesley's theology. There were Puritans as members of this group as well. And so George Whitefield, for example, who was a very famous preacher, especially in America, he was very popular in America, and he spread Christianity in the colonies. He was a close friend of John and Charles Wesley, but he also disagreed with them a lot, and so they also bickered over the years. John Wesley has wielded a wider constructive influence, according to William Lecky, on Britain in the 18th century. John Wesley has wielded a wider constructive influence in the sphere of practical Christianity than any other man who has appeared since the 16th century. And the Oxford English Dictionary says, on the Christian Church, says that John Wesley was one of the greatest Christians of his age. And so John Wesley was very prolific in his writing. He is considered a practical theologian. He's not somebody that does a lot of thought about, like we have word I'm looking for. We have practical theology, and then we have, Anyway, the form of theology where people more consider who God is and different explanations of God, versus Wesley, his theology was around how to implement orthodox ideas about God in the church. And so he came up with a way of spreading the gospel and to grow the church. And we call this the Wesleyan way. It's a methodical way of following Jesus. It involves a theological emphasis on particularly grace, the ideas of grace, that God's grace in our lives and how it works in our lives. It also gives a lot of it puts a lot of power to the laity. It requires a vile laity, and that's the ordinary congregants, the people that aren't clergy. So in the Wesleyan movement, many of the preachers were not ordained pastors. In fact, John Wesley for a while was one of the few, was one of the few ordained pastors in the Wesleyan movement, in the Methodist movement. Although Charles was an ordained pastor, George Whitefield, but he also had many people that he would send out to preach that were not, didn't go through an ordination. And ordination is a special process where the church, and this is the Anglican church, not there's no such thing at this point as a Wesley or Methodist church. This is just a movement within the Anglican church. It's kind of like renewal movements within denominations if there was a renewal movements within the Methodist church. He was still considered himself an Anglican. But he also rubbed a lot of pastors the wrong way, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Other pastors, a lot of his colleagues. There's an emphasis on preaching. So and he would choose regular people to be preachers, but they had to be skilled at preaching and interpreting the gospel and spreading the word. There was a radical love of neighbor, which includes serving and evangelism. Lots of writing, lots of literature. John Wesley was prolific, wrote quite a bit, and there was a lot of singing. Hymn books were printed at the time. So John took the ascendancy. So even though John and Charles worked together as a team, Charles eventually started a family, and he couldn't travel around, I mean, as much as John did. So he stopped traveling around and preaching, and so John sort of took sort of the reins of the Methodist movement. He pretty much devoted his life to serving in the church. So John Wesley was born in 1703, and he was the 15th child in his family. Yeah, big family, yeah. In 1714, he was sent off to Charterhouse School, which was a prestigious school in London that his dad attended. Now, being a pastor's son, he didn't have a lot of money, but he relied on scholarships to go there. And when he graduated from that school, he went to Christ Church, which is not a church really, but it's a school at Oxford University. And Christ Church is probably one of the most prestigious schools in Oxford. And so he was a very good student. And he got his master's at Oxford in 1727. He did get married, but he had no children. And he and his wife he traveled around a lot. So after a while, they separated. She went to go live with his her mother, because John was never home. And so this is one of the struggles I think that John Wesley had in his life was, he devoted his whole life to the church. And in reality, probably would have been a good idea if he didn't get married at all, but he did. He traveled, to give an indication of how much he moved around, he traveled 250,000 to 300,000 miles on horseback to go out and preach. And Charles Wesley is younger than John, born about 4 years after. Also considered one of the founders of Methodism. He also went to Oxford to join John. He married in 1749, and he has 3 children. He had 8 children, but in those days, many children didn't survive. And so only 3 survived in infancy, but 2 of them became successful hymn writers in their own right, Samuel and Charles Jr. And Charles, again, like his dad, became very famous in the 1800s. Charles Wesley wrote 6,500 hymns. Can you imagine? That's a lot. It's very prolific. And many of them are our favorites, like Christ the Lord is risen today, Hark the Herald Angels Sing, so many songs that he had written. We still sing a lot of them in our church today. Here's a picture of the cover of one of the first hymn books that they produced. Now, John Wesley, they had, within the movement, they had a printer. So they would print their own books and distribute them when they went out. So he became very prolific and well-known because of his books and the hymn books. And then what they would do is, again, because these hymns were not necessarily sung in a church service in the way, like in the Anglican service, they would be sung in meetings. And basically their meetings were kind of like our non-denominational churches today. It was singing and preaching pretty much. And so they would sing hymns and then they would listen to the word and then they would preach. They also had small groups, different bands that they called them. He had a whole structure of small groups, and we'll talk a little bit more about that structure later, but again, they don't call them Methodists for nothing. And again, his primary legacy in Methodism are on his hymns. Yes. Yes, and so this is from the American Methodist Discipline. This is we might hear every once in a while we talk about the Book of Discipline, which sounds very austere. But the Book of Discipline are the rules of the Methodist Church, and also they're the minutes of each of their annual conferences. So whenever they come, they had annual conferences at the time. They would, after the minutes, they'd make their decisions and write them down in a new discipline. And so they had somebody would take the minutes and they would record the speeches and the new rules that they came up with. And then they would write them down in paragraph form, kind of like I'll show you a little bit later of what the Book of Discipline looks like today. But in the American Methodist Discipline in 1805, it says, in every large society, let them learn to sing, and let them always learn our tunes first. Because, there were other tunes. The Lutherans were also big singers. Some of the ideas of Methodist theology is that all can be saved. We don't believe in predestination, that some people are predestined to be saved, and that we can all know that we are saved. Sometimes, so a lot of this was a reaction, and this is what caused the conflict with the Puritans in the group, because the Puritans are Calvinists, and the Calvinists believe in predestination. So the Methodist theology is not predestination, but that all can be saved, and all can know that they're saved, and all can be saved completely, total sanctification. And it also believes in that our faith is expressed in our fruit, in what we do. It's not just merely believing, but also how we live out our faith. Even though Wesley believed that we're saved by our faith, like Martin Luther, he also believed that our works were important because they were the fruit of our faith. And also he has an ecumenical spirit, which means he accepts other denominations and other groups, and he tries to establish relationships with other denominations and other groups. He called that Catholicism. That's what Catholicism actually means: universal. Really, it doesn't really mean like the Catholic Church, but the Catholic Church used that because they consider themselves the universal church. But John Wesley has a sermon called "The Catholic Spirit," but he's not talking about Catholics. He's talking about the idea of being open to all denominations. And he also said that the world is his parish. He did not confine himself to one church. He went out and preached everywhere. And all Methodists we're meant to. This refers to our connectionalism, that we believe we're connected to other churches. And sometimes we can miss that because we operate a lot of times as a church on our own, but we have a very strong connection with other Methodist churches in the area. Okay. Grace, those are also important ideas of Methodism. Prevenient grace, which is how God prepares us before we come to know Jesus. Justifying grace is when we know and accept that Jesus saves us. And sanctifying grace is sustaining and perfecting. These are free and available to all. And then the means of grace. The means of grace are ways that we live out our grace. And grace means an undeserved gift that God gives us. So we get those gifts through these, what he calls means of grace, through communion, through baptism, through fasting, through prayer, reading scripture, and Christian conference, or what we're doing today, gathering together and celebrating and breaking bread, all these things. These are all considered means of grace. And also, as we think about these things, we also can reflect on our future, the future of the church. If we go back to our roots, can be strong. We have wonderful institutions in our church. We have great universities. There are wonderful people, as we know, all gathered here today. We have great assets in the church, many different churches all over the world. And but we need to remember our distinctiveness. We need to remember, and which is why I think this class is so important, to remember to think about what we believe as Methodists, and to remember our roots. They're very important. It's very important to remember where we came from, and also maybe apply some of these methods today. Okay, so in our movie we talked about John Wesley's parents. Susanna Wesley was John's mother. She was born 1669, and Samuel Wesley. They had 17 to 19 children. They're not sure because many of them died in childbirth. There were only 10 that survived. Yeah, only 10 children survived. So that's a lot of children, a lot of heartache in that family. Samuel Wesley, as we were talking about the Society for the Proliferation of Christian Knowledge, he was a member of that society. And in the society, they prayed together as a group, read and discussed scripture for edification, deliberated about how to edify others and care for the poor. So this was that movement I was talking about, where they were trying to get the Anglican Church back to an idea of holiness, personal holiness. And so Samuel Wesley was definitely a proponent of that, but he was also very loyal to his church. The oldest son was Samuel Wesley. He did not become a pastor. And John, as we mentioned, was born in 1703, and Charles in 1707, and there were seven girls, seven sisters that survived into adulthood. Now, Susanna Wesley was a very well-educated young woman and very literate, very well-read, very well-spoken. And we'll read a little bit. We're going to go through a couple of her letters to see, to give you an example. She was also of a large family, the youngest of 25 children. And at the age of 19 is when she met Samuel Wesley, who was already a bright young clergyman. And so Susanna Wesley was really responsible for teaching teaching the children in the family. She focused on training all the children, girls and boys, because she grew up with a good education. She wanted her daughters to have a good education too. And she would spend a little bit of one-on-one time with each child every week. Can you imagine, with 10 children? I don't know how long, some of the children that passed away, I don't know how long they lived, but she was very busy even with 10 children. And so she was also very regimented, because, to be able to divide your time like that, you need to be able to organize your time really well and also run the household. So along with Samuel, they took the spiritual leadership in the family, and she was a bit of a nonconformist. She was so good with her Bible studies that she would, the way she would lead women's studies. And one year when Samuel Wesley was out of town, and his sort of associate pastor was leading the service, he was kind of a boring teacher. So a lot of the people went to Susanna Wesley's Bible studies and had foregone going to church because the pastor was so boring. So Samuel Wesley had to write a letter to her and ask her to stop. And she wrote back and she said, if when we meet the Lord in heaven someday, and the Lord asks you why, I said, I'll stop as long as you feel that you can give a good answer to the Lord when he asks you why you stopped me from spreading the gospel. So Samuel relented, so she continued. So she was very strong-willed. There were 16, she had a series of 16 rules for the kids. And this is the idea of how regimented they were. There was no eating between meals. I'll just kind of jump through a little of these. The children were in bed by 8. They were required to take medicine without complaining. She taught them to pray as soon as they could speak. She required all to be there during family worship. So they all got together as a family to worship and sing hymns together. She did give them nothing that they cry, and only that when they ask politely. So if the kids cry, she won't respond. She only responds. She was very strong-willed, and the kids were very well behaved. She never punished a child twice for a single offense. So she was fair. And she strictly observed all of her promises. If she made a promise, she carried it out. And she taught the children to fear the rod. Okay. Here's a letter from John's mother when John was an adult, just to give you an idea of the correspondence. He wrote to John, to his mom for advice, and this is when he was an adult at that time. And he said, I plainly see that every hour produces occasions of self-pleasing, and this I apprehend is a sufficient call for and rule of self-denial. For instance, in the morning it is great self-denial to rise out of a warm bed, but if I do not, I am immediately condemned as a slothful servant. If I do, I find a great inward blessing. In walking the streets, I can please myself by looking this way and that, on this chariot, that house and picture. But if I deny myself for Christ's sake, his consolations abound with me. So very pious man John Wesley was at that time. I think he was still at Oxford. His mother replied, "Would you judge of the lawfulness or the unlawfulness of pleasures? Take this rule. Whatever weakens your reason, impairs the tenderness of your conscience, obscures your sense of God, or takes off the relish of spiritual things. In short, whatever increases the strength and authority of your body over your mind, that is sin to you, however innocent it may be." Okay, so I mean, she had written quite a bit over the years, and here's a letter that she wrote to Charles right before she passed away, which is really kind of telling of her life, especially when she came close to death. Shortly before Susanna died at 73, she wrote Charles Wesley to describe her faith. She admitted that for years she struggled with doubt and confusion about her salvation, but that she finally had complete peace. When I had forgotten God, then I then found he had not forgotten me. Even then, he did by his Spirit apply his merits of the great atonement to my soul by telling me that Christ died for me. With her family gathered around her by her bedside during her final illness, she said, "Children, as soon as I am released, sing a psalm of praise to God." And her grave marker reads in part, "A Christian here her flesh laid down, the cross exchanging for a crown." Okay, Samuel Wesley was pastor of Epworth and Root parishes. Epworth is where the Wesleys spent most of their life. Here's a picture we saw in our movie, the inside of the parsonage at Epworth. They mentioned in the movie that the church had burned down in 1709. And Adam Hamilton mentioned that Samuel wasn't very popular among his fellow church parishioners. And he suspected that one of them might have started the fire. And it could have been tragic. John Wesley was stuck on the second floor during the fire. And at that point, when he saw him there, he tried to rush in, but the flames were too much. And so he knelt down to pray with his neighbors. And then a couple of his neighbors got together and they put one on the back of the other and they pulled him out of the window. And so his mother had come up with this term from Zechariah, that he was like a brand plucked from the burning. And many times he looked back on this rescue as the confirmation that God had a call for his life, that God had spared him in this fire, and that he must have a purpose in his life. So these were the three shaping events in his life at Epworth: fire, his Bible study with his mom, and also the society meetings that his parents would have with the Society for the Liberation of Christian Knowledge. And he also learned a commitment to Christ, a valuing of the beliefs in the tenets of the church, the priority of scripture, the disciplined devotional life, and global mission. Okay, so I'm going to end this now. We have a couple questions. Okay, any questions or any ideas, any thoughts from the movie or from the presentation so far?
No, I just missed something. Who was it who took what he didn't like?
That was Thomas Jefferson.
Oh.
He's a deist, yeah. Yeah, so Thomas Jefferson, I think there's you can find copies of Thomas Jefferson's version of the Bible. He didn't like a lot of the miracles and things like that because he was very rational in that. So he looked at a lot of the moral teachings.
When you did school, did they use spanking or not?
Yes, they did. It said that you know, they in those days, that's what they did. To fear the rod, as Susanna said. Yeah. So it's a very pious upbringing. From this point, next week, we're going to talk a little bit more. We're going to talk about his John Wesley's time at Oxford. And I have a couple of questions. We try not to keep this too long. I'm afraid to keep this on time, but I might find a question here.
Pastor John,
Yes.
at this time in history, wasn't it rather unusual for a woman to have that kind of influence?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, she executed her influence inside the home. So, but what was really unusual for her is that she was so well educated. Her dad believed that she should get a good education, and she was taught in the classics. So so there's no doubt. I mean, John and Charles both went to Oxford, and I think Samuel went to university too. I'm not sure. Samuel became a doctor, the oldest. So they were all very intelligent. The daughters wrote as well. So, you know, the mother used her great education to be, you know, phenomenal teacher for her children. But yeah, it was unusual, and especially that part where, you know, she'd lead women's studies, and her women's studies were popular with men too, because she was so good. I mean, to be that with such an organized mind, and also somebody that was such a good writer who was so articulate, you can imagine she'd be very popular. So she was probably, I mean, I think John would say that she was probably his biggest spiritual influence in his life. Okay. Go on, let's ask one question. Okay, so we mentioned at the end that John Wesley felt like God had a special purpose in his life because he was saved from a fire. Have you felt that God has preserved you for a special purpose? Anybody have any ideas or thoughts? I know sometimes this can sound grandiose, you know, but I think, you know, all of us has a special purpose in our lives. And sometimes we're uncomfortable sharing, you know, some of these ideas, but I mean, you know, not to sound, you know, too boastful, but I think it's appropriate to think that way, to think that God has a special purpose in their lives. Does anybody have anything that they'd like to share about their lives?
It's not. My closest cousin couldn't figure out why his wife was killed in an auto accident, but he was spared in the same accident. And finally I said, it's because you're the one who ended up taking care of your second wife.
Ah.
So no wonder you were spared.
Did you guys hear that?
No.
No, they didn't hear. Yeah, everybody in here heard it, but no, yeah, on the line. Okay, Carol said that that her friend who had been in an auto accident had always wondered why God spared him, and that his wife was killed, and he was spared, and he wondered why. He always wondered why he was spared, and then Carol said, well, she said you were he had to take care of his second wife too, so he had a purpose in his life after that. You know, and spared. And it's funny because this is a difficult thing. It's like, it leads to that question, does God cause the accidents that we start in? Why does God choose to save some people and not others? And I think that's another that's another big theological discussion. But I think that what's important is what we make of our lives after the fact, right? And I think a lot of times these things in our lives change us and give us the ability to do things we have to do later in life. So I think this being plucked from the fire obviously gave John Wesley the resolve of that God had a purpose for him. You know, that there was something, that this was something important to him. A lot of us believe in our lives that when we're born, you know, I think we have a purpose in the relationships that we have. I think that's a big thing. Like all of our relationships are important in how we interact with each other, and I think that's and that can change people's lives. For a while, there was that movie. What was that movie? 6 Degrees of Separation, that talked about how everybody is connected, and I think that's a big. I think that sometimes we don't. And then there's another concept called the butterfly effect. I don't know if this is true. They say a butterfly flaps its wings in Asia and causes and tornadoes happen in the other parts. Basically, the idea is that everything is connected, right? Ecosystems are connected, and sometimes when we change one thing, the repercussions affect something else. So I think the same thing happens in our relationships and how we interact with each other. And God's grace is, I think, through that, and sometimes going through bad experiences too, change us, and we learn. As long as we can keep our hearts open to love, you know, to continue to love even after difficult things happen to us. Any other observations or thoughts on that?
Where was we? You know, think about when I first went to the church, because my neighbor went, but my family was
Yeah. So Peggy was sharing that where would we have been if John Wesley had died in the fire and it was Charles? Charles would have written some hymns, but he wouldn't have been able to lead the movement. And then Peggy also reflected on they were intending to go to one church and they ended up going to the Methodist church, right, that you went to? Is that what you're, yeah. Yeah. That's right. Her neighbor invited her to church, and that's how Peggy got into the Methodist church, by going to that Methodist church on the corner. Were you raised a Methodist, Peggy, or did you, that's when it started? When you were a child, you were taken, yeah. That's a neat story. So Peggy's neighbor took her to church. She wasn't, her parents didn't go to church, but her neighbor took her to church, and that's how she's a Methodist today. So that's that interaction, you know, and the family interaction.
Oh, okay.
This setup is great. I'm going to try next week to try to get it so that we can pick up more conversations out. Doing a hybrid of people here and online. You guys miss what people say here, and I have to repeat it. But we'll work it out as best as we can going forward. And maybe I can get away where I could pass the microphone around. I'll bring that wireless down. Any other ideas or thoughts?
Just a question. Charles wrote 6,500 hymns, something like that. I am curious when our society got to the point that music was written down in the form of notes and so on that we have today. Because obviously he must have been using them in the 1700s.
Yeah, so they think they had the system that we have of writing notes, and so maybe I could find next week a picture of what the original hymn book looked like inside. But you know, back then, I mean, this would have been at the time of Bach, I think, and Handel. So yeah, mid 1700s. Mozart would come around towards the end, so it would be like, yeah, Bach and Handel would have been the composers at the time, and I think the music by that time was pretty elaborate. But hymn singing was fairly, I mean, Wesley, I think the Methodist movement emphasized it more than a lot of movements did. Singing was very, in fact, and I think also the idea of worshiping at home, the hymn books were meant to be taken home, and people were meant to sing at home in their practices, and everybody was expected to have a nightly family worship service together, where they read a scripture and talk about it together and sing hymns and that sort of thing. That's part of it. Yeah.
Pastor John,
Uh-huh.
I just happened to have a hymnal at home,
Yeah.
and I opened it up. And if you look under Charles Wesley, there's about 51 hymns in there.
Uh-huh.
Then there are a selection of poems, responses, and then there's a few by John Wesley, Samuel Wesley, and a Wesley whose name is Samuel Sebastian. Who would Samuel Sebastian have been?
That probably is Charles's son.
Okay.
Or maybe it's a fourth generation. What year was it written? Does it say?
Let's see. It says he, for my classes, he survived, or he was, Samuel Sebastian was 1810 to 1876.
Yeah, so that was probably Charles Wesley's son.
Yeah, because Charles Wesley was 1707 to 1788.
No, that would have been his grandson because he died before John did. John Wesley died in like 1791.
Yeah.
And Charles died like a few years before that.
Yeah, 1788 rather.
So it's probably Samuel's Wesley's kid. Yes. Okay. Wow. 3 generations of hymn writers in that family.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah.
We'll have to have a Wesley Song Fest one of these days.
Oh yeah. Oh,
And go, we'd only be able to do one verse, or we'd be there all day, but you know, we could do that. That might be fun.
Yeah, a great idea for one of the events as we celebrate the 100th year.
That would be good.
Yeah.
That would be great. How about a hymn night?
Yeah.
So, you know, we'll feature obviously Charles Wesley, but also other great Methodist hymns that we have, great hymns in our hymn book that we've been singing for a long time. Fanny Crosby was also one that used to, some good women hymn writers in there. Okay, well, that is all I have for today. Let's close in prayer. Let me get I'll bring this up so we can all recite it together. Let me just go to share it. Zoom, okay. Okay. Oh, shoot. Sorry, I lost my, there we go. Okay, let's share it again.
Aha.
Okay. We would have sung today, "Oh God, fount of every blessing," but I'm still a little nervous about. See, right now we don't have our masks on, so we're gonna not do it today. So, but this prayer is inspired by that hymn. Let us pray. Maybe we could recite this together. Oh God,
Fount of every blessing.
There
are times when we are prone to wander from you, your love. We give thanks that your love is there, sustaining us in times when our passion for you is diminished. Through this time together, we revive our hearts for your ministry.
in the name
of Jesus Christ.
Amen.
Amen.
Okay, stop share. Oh, wait, where are you guys? Stop share. Okay. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Aloha.
Aloha.
Aloha,
Bye.
everybody.
See everyone.
Take care.
Have a good week.
You too.